It begins quietly. Not with a castle. Not with a crown. But with ashes. Cold gray dust clinging to the floor. The kind that settles into the skin and never quite comes off. The kind that smells like yesterday's fire. We think we know Cinderella. We've heard her name since childhood. We've seen her story painted in soft colors, wrapped in music, sealed with a happy ending. A girl in ashes. A cruel home. A single night of magic. It feels simple. Almost kind. But stories don't survive for centuries because they are simple. They survive because they carry something heavier. Something older. Picture her at the beginning. Not dancing. Not smiling. She is bent low, scrubbing the floor. Her hands are raw. Her back aches. Around her, the house moves on without her. Laughter echoes from rooms she cannot enter. Silk brushes past her shoulder. Perfume fills the air, sharp and sweet. She does not belong to that world. They call her Cinderella. Not a name, but a label. A reminder of where she sleeps. Near the fire. Near the ash. In many old versions, she had another name once. A real one. But it is gone now. Stripped away. And that matters. Because when someone loses their name, they lose more than identity. They lose voice. They lose place. They lose power. Cinderella does not argue. She does not scream. She learns to be quiet. She learns that survival sometimes means becoming invisible. At night, when the house finally sleeps, she whispers her dreams into the dark. Not to anyone who might answer. Just to the air. Just to herself. She dreams of something different. Not riches. Not revenge. Just escape. And then, like we remember, it happens. Magic. A figure appears from nowhere. A gentle voice. A wave of light. Rags become silk. Ash becomes beauty. The girl becomes someone worth looking at. For one night. That detail matters too. Only one night. The clock is always watching. The time is always limited. This is not freedom. It is permission. Borrowed. Temporary. And still, we are told this is the happiest moment of her life. Glass slippers. Music. A palace glowing like a dream. The prince sees her. Really sees her, so the story says. But does he? He doesn't know her name. He doesn't know her life. He doesn't know where she sleeps. He knows only how she looks under the light. And when the clock strikes midnight, the magic breaks. She runs. Not because she is careless. But because she knows something we often forget. That if she stays, she will disappear again. The dress fades. The carriage cracks. The horses fall apart. And she is back in ashes. We tell this part softly to children. As if it is harmless. As if it is just suspense. But there is something unsettling here. Why does her transformation depend on magic? Why is her suffering never confronted, only escaped? Why does no one save her until she becomes beautiful? And why, always, does the story begin in ashes? Ashes are not random. In old times, ashes meant loss. They meant mourning. They meant what was left after something burned. People sat in ashes when they grieved. They covered themselves in dust to show humility, sorrow, survival. To live among ashes was to live close to endings. Cinderella does not just clean near the fire. She belongs to it. She is placed at the edge of the household. Between warmth and ruin. Between life and forgetting. That is not accidental. Because long before castles and gowns, before glass slippers and fairy godmothers, there was already a girl like her. Not one girl. Many. Women pushed to the margins. Orphans. Servants. Daughters who lost protection. Their stories were not told in books. They were told in whispers. In kitchens. Near fires. Stories of endurance. Stories of waiting. Stories of hope that had to be quiet to survive. Cinderella did not begin as a romance. She began as a reflection. A mirror held up to those who had no voice. Over time, the story softened. The edges were rounded. The pain was dressed in sparkle. But traces remain. Why does she never fight back? Why does the story reward patience, not justice? Why is the happy ending not change, but removal? Because the original truth is harder to face. Cinderella is not a story about love. It is a story about power. Who has it? Who loses it? And what someone must become to get it back. She does not rise because the world becomes fair. She rises because she fits into it, just enough. And that is uncomfortable. Because it asks us a quiet question. What kind of world only notices suffering when it looks beautiful? We don't ask that question when we are children. We are not meant to. But the story stays with us anyway. It waits. And when we are older, it begins to sound different. The ashes feel heavier. The silence feels louder. The magic feels fragile. And we start to sense it. That Cinderella is older than fairy tales. Older than princes. Older than happy endings. She is a memory. One passed down through centuries. From those who sat near the fire and wondered if life would ever change. And maybe that is why the story never disappears. Because somewhere inside us, we remember what it feels like to be unseen. To be named by our lowest place. To wait quietly for a moment that may never come. And perhaps that is why the story always begins in ashes. Because that is where the truth was first spoken. Low, soft, and never meant to be forgotten. It begins far from castles. Far from velvet dresses and shining floors. It begins with a road made of dust, and a story carried by breath. A whisper that crossed centuries before it ever reached a book. The oldest Cinderella story does not come from France. Not from Europe. Not from the world we picture when we hear her name. It comes from ancient China. Picture a small village. Wooden homes. Quiet mornings. Smoke rising gently into the sky. Here, over 1,000 years before glass slippers, there was a girl named Yician. She was not born special. She was not chosen. She was simply left behind. After her parents died, Yician was taken in by a stepmother who saw her as a burden. Not as a child. Not as family. Yician wore rags. She slept near the fire. She worked while others rested. If this sounds familiar, it should. But Yician had something Cinderella did not. A friend. A small fish she fed in secret. Bright-eyed. Gentle. Alive. In ancient China, fish were symbols of fortune and renewal. They were signs of life continuing, even in silence. That fish mattered. Because when the stepmother discovered it, she killed it. Out of jealousy. Out of fear. The fish was cooked. Eaten. Erased. But its bones were saved. And here, the story turned strange. The bones became magical. They answered Yician's wishes. They helped her escape her sorrow, if only for a moment. Not through beauty. Not through romance. But through survival. Yician attends a festival. She loses a shoe. A small one. Delicate. Unusual. The ruler searches for the girl whose foot can wear it. And when Yician is found, she is lifted from the ashes. This is Cinderella, before Europe ever touched her. And the story doesn't stop there. Travel west. Across deserts. Across rivers. Across time. In ancient Egypt, another echo appears. A servant girl. Not royal. Not powerful. One day, her sandal is taken by an eagle and dropped into the lap of a king. The king does not laugh. He does not ignore it. He searches the land. Because in ancient Egypt, shoes were more than clothing. They marked status. Identity. Belonging. Only one woman could wear that sandal. When she is found, she becomes queen. No fairy godmother. No pumpkin. Just fate, watching quietly. And then, again, the pattern returns. In Greece. In the Middle East. In early tribal Europe. Different names. Different places. But the same shape. A young woman pushed to the edge of society. A girl without protection. Marked by loss. She is placed near the hearth. Near the dirt. Near the fire. She works while others rise. She is unseen. These stories appear in cultures that never met. Never shared borders. Never spoke the same language. And yet, they tell the same story. Not because it was copied. But because it was lived. These were not fairy tales. They were survival stories. Passed quietly. Carefully. From mother to daughter. From aunt to niece. From women who knew what it meant to endure. They were warnings. And they were hope. They said, you may be pushed down. You may be forgotten. But you are not gone. Over time, these stories traveled like smoke. They changed shape. They gained magic. They lost sharp edges. By the time they reached Europe, they were polished. Gentler. Safer. The bones became a fairy godmother. The fish became a spell. The ritual became romance. But the core remained. A woman at the margins. A test of identity. A moment when the world finally looks at her. And this repetition tells us something important. Humans across time understood the same fear. The fear of being erased. The fear of losing family, safety, name. In ancient societies, losing protection meant losing everything. Stories like Cinderella were not fantasies. They were maps. They showed how someone might survive a world that offered no mercy. They taught patience. Silence. Endurance. Not because those traits are fair. But because they were necessary. This is why the story appears again and again. Because the hearth was once the center of life. The fire was sacred. The one who tended it held power, quiet power. Cinderella figures were not weak. They were guardians of continuity. They kept homes alive while others slept. They held memory. And when these stories were told aloud, late at night, they carried a promise. That identity cannot be destroyed. Only buried. That even in ashes, something waits. Something remembers. And perhaps that is why the shoe matters so much. Across cultures, it appears again and again. A small object. Personal. Intimate. It cannot be shared. It cannot be borrowed. It fits only one. The shoe is the soul. A reminder that no matter how hidden someone becomes, who they are will always seek recognition. These ancient stories didn't promise happiness. They promised survival. They said, "You may be unseen now, but the world does not forget forever." And as these stories moved forward through time, they carried that quiet truth with them. From China, from Egypt, from firesides across continents, from people who endured, to people who hoped. And as the centuries passed, the story dressed itself in beauty. But underneath, the old echoes still breathe, waiting. Because Cinderella was never one girl. She was many. And her story was never meant to entertain. It was meant to be remembered. Maybe that's why, even now, when we hear her name, something inside us stirs, like a memory we didn't know we carried. It begins with what is left behind. Not fire. Not flame. But ash. Fine and gray. Cold to the touch. Clinging to skin, to cloth, to memory. To us, ashes are just dirt. Something to sweep away. Something unwanted. But to ancient people, ashes meant everything. They were what remained after fire had done its work. After something had been burned. After something had changed forever. Ashes were not the end. They were proof that something had lived. Long ago, when a person lost someone they loved, they sat in ashes. They covered their hair with dust. They lowered themselves to the ground. It was not shame. It was truth. A way of saying, I have been broken, and I am still here. This is where Cinderella begins. Not in beauty. Not in hope. But in ash. She does not live near the fire by accident. She is placed there. At the hearth. The heart of the home. In ancient houses, the hearth was sacred. It was where meals were made. Where warmth survived winter. Where stories were told in the dark. It was also where the dead were remembered. Ashes from old fires were never fully thrown away. They carried memory. They carried protection. The hearth was the line between life and death. And Cinderella was made to live there. Not because she was worthless. But because she was close to something powerful. She slept near the fire. Worked near the fire. Breathed its smoke. Day after day, she was covered in what remained. Ash. To the outside world, she looked small. Dirty. Forgettable. But to ancient eyes, she was undergoing something. Transformation always begins low. In old stories, heroes are not born shining. They are stripped first. Names are taken. Comfort is removed. Identity is broken down. Only then can something new form. Cinderella loses everything that once defined her. Family. Status. Voice. She becomes the girl in ashes. And that is not weakness. That is the beginning of rebirth. Fire destroys, yes. But it also cleans. It takes what was and turns it into what can be again. Cinderella is not waiting to be saved. She is waiting to become. This is why her rise is not loud. It is quiet. She does not storm the house. She does not demand justice. She endures. That word matters. Endurance is not passive. It is active survival. It is choosing to keep going when nothing changes. It is holding on to self when the world refuses to see you. Ancient people understood this deeply. They lived close to death. Close to hunger. Close to loss. They knew that life moved in cycles. Burn. Ash. Renewal. Cinderella lives inside that cycle. And then there is the shoe. We are told it is glass. Delicate. Beautiful. But glass came late. In older versions, the shoe is gold. Or leather. Or fur. The material changes. The meaning does not. Shoes were personal. They touched the ground. They carried the body forward. They marked where someone had been. In many ancient cultures, shoes were tied to identity. To destiny. To the soul's path. You did not wear another person's shoes. Not just because they wouldn't fit, but because they were not yours. To wear the wrong shoe was to live the wrong life. This is why the test matters. Not because it proves beauty, but because it proves truth. The shoe does not choose Cinderella. It recognizes her. Only the rightful owner can wear it. Only the one who has walked that path can step into it again. The prince does not fall in love with her suffering. He does not rescue her from ashes. He finds her because something undeniable fits. Something true. Cinderella is not lifted because she is pretty. She is lifted because she endured long enough to remain herself. This is the part the fairy tale often hides. Endurance was once sacred. Ancient cultures honored those who could carry pain without losing their core. Those who could sit in ashes and not disappear. The hearthkeeper was not lowly. They were trusted. They held the home together. They remembered the dead. They fed the living. They kept the fire alive. Cinderella's work was not meaningless. It was central. And when she rises, she does not abandon that truth. She carries it with her. This is why the story has survived. Not because it promises romance, but because it speaks to something deep and human. The fear of being reduced. The fear of being forgotten. The fear that suffering means nothing. Cinderella answers that fear softly. She says, you can be buried and still be becoming. She says, ash is not the end. And maybe that is why the story still moves us. Because we have all sat in ashes at some point. After loss. After failure. After a version of ourselves burned away. We recognize her posture. Head low. Hands working. Heart still alive. We recognize the weight. And we recognize the moment when something fits again. When identity returns. Not because the world changed. But because we survived it. Cinderella is not chosen by magic. Magic only reveals what was already there. And as the story moves forward, it will soften again. Ash will fade into sparkle. Ritual into romance. But the truth remains underneath. Quiet. Patient. Waiting. Because rebirth does not announce itself. It happens slowly. In silence. Near the fire. And maybe that's why the story still lives. Because somewhere inside us, we know what it means. To rise from what remains. It ends the way it began. Quietly. Not with a wedding bell. Not with a crown. But with memory. A story passed hand to hand. Voice to voice. Long after the fire has gone cold. Over time, the story softened. The sharp edges were sanded down. The smoke cleared. The ashes were hidden. What was once ritual became magic. What was once survival became romance. Ashes turned into rags. Rags turned into silk. Silk turned into a dream. And yet, the core never disappeared. Because stories don't last that long unless they carry truth. Cinderella survived because she meant something deeper than we were ever told. She is not a story about waiting to be saved. That idea came later. She is a story about surviving long enough to be seen. There is a difference. Waiting is passive. Surviving is not. Surviving means waking up again. Even when nothing changes. Even when no one notices. Surviving means holding on to who you are. When the world tries to rename you, relabel you, erase you. Cinderella's true struggle is not her stepmother. It is not the house. It is not even poverty. It is invisibility. She is there, but not counted. Present, but not valued. She works so the house can live, yet she is treated like a ghost moving through it. And that feeling, that quiet erasure, is older than any fairy tale. Every culture has known it. That is why the story keeps returning. In different lands. In different centuries. With different names. Because the experience it describes is human. To be pushed aside. To be reduced. To be told, without words, that you do not matter. And yet, to remain. Cinderella remains. She does not become bitter. She does not forget herself. She remembers. That is the part we overlook. Memory. The story is not about magic changing her life. It is about memory refusing to die. She remembers who she was before the ashes. Before the silence. Before the name was taken. And the world eventually remembers too. Not because it suddenly becomes fair. But because truth has weight. It presses upward. Over time, the story was reshaped for comfort. Pain was softened so children could sleep. Suffering was shortened. Justice was replaced with love. We turned a survival story into a wish. And maybe that says something about us. We like endings where someone else fixes things. We like rescue more than endurance. We like beauty more than truth. But the original story does not promise rescue. It promises recognition. That if you survive long enough, if you endure without losing yourself, something true will surface. The shoe does not fall from the sky. It is left behind. A trace. Proof that she was there. Proof that she existed in that world, even if the world tried to forget her. That is what the shoe really is. Evidence. And evidence matters. Because history is full of people who lived in ashes. And were never recorded. Their stories were not written. Their names were not saved. But their feelings survived. And they poured them into stories. Stories like Cinderella. That is why we still recognize her. Even now. Even in a modern world. Because we know what it feels like. To be unseen at work. Unheard at home. Judged by surface alone. We know what it feels like. To be reduced to a role, a label, a function. And we know the quiet hope. That one day, someone might see past it. Cinderella does not change who she is to be accepted. She reveals who she has always been. That distinction matters. Because the story is not telling us to dream of princes. It is telling us not to forget ourselves. Even when the world buries us under expectation, under cruelty, under ash. The fire does not erase her. It refines her. The ashes do not destroy her. They mark the passage. And when the story ends, not with romance, but with recognition, we are left with something quieter. A reminder. That identity can be hidden, but not erased. That memory can be buried, but not destroyed. And that survival itself is a form of truth. Maybe that is why the story keeps returning. Again and again. Across borders. Across centuries. Because it is not really about Cinderella. It is about us. About the parts of ourselves that have sat near the fire, waiting. About the versions of us that were overlooked, yet endured. And maybe Cinderella was never meant to teach us to dream of castles or crowns. Maybe she was meant to teach us to remember who we are, even when the world tries to reduce us to ash. Maybe that's why the story still lives quietly inside all of us.